Hi everybody, I'm Stefan for Tuts+, and in today's tutorial I'm going to show you how to shoot and post-process HDR time-lapse. Here is a list of all the topics I'm going to cover in the tutorial. You need at least entry-level DSLR camera that supports exposure bracketing. The lens depends on the location you plan to shoot. Most of the time, kit lens, which is 18 to 55 mm, will do the job. Fast and large memory card is needed to shoot such a time-lapse. I suggest at least 32 GB card with data transfer of at least 30 to 45 MB per second. Last but not least, you need a decent tripod and an intervalometer. Like when we shoot a normal time-lapse, we need to make sure all of our settings are set to manual. Switch your camera to manual mode and set all of the settings to manual. Once we do that, we need to enable the exposure bracketing option of the camera. After we set the exposure bracketing, we need to set the shooting mode of the camera to continuous in order to be able to shoot 3 pictures with different exposures at a time. The time interval depends on what you are shooting. In my case, for the preview video, I used a time interval of 10 seconds. Once you set the time interval, you need to go into your intervalometer settings for long exposure and set it to 2. When you set your camera in continuous shooting mode and set the exposure manually and combine it with exposure bracketing, this will allow you to shoot 3 different exposures at a time. Here we are in SNS-HDR Pro, and I'm going to start editing the HDR time-lapse sequence. First of all, I'm going to select the first 3 photos from my raw sequence and drag and drop them into SNS-HDR Pro, and a dialog box appears which asks me if I want a size reduction of the images, and in this case I don't want. It asks me to align the images, and since I shot this sequence using a tripod, I don't need to align the images. I want the deghosting and noise reduction option turned on, and I want to click OK right now. I don't want any noise reduction in RAW because I used a settings with a minimal ISO, so I don't have any noise in my photos. And let's click OK, and it takes a while for the software to analyze and process the images. And this is what we get by default from the software, and I'm going to explain the most important settings you need to know about in order to start editing your sequences. As you can see, the software is pretty simple. We have only a few panels and sliders here. So let's start right here. As you can see, we have some presets that we can use as a starting point. In order to see a preset, you just need to put your mouse on top of the name of the preset, and it is going to show you how your image is going to look like using the preset. In case you want to load a preset, you just need to select one and click on it. In this case, I really like the night preset. Actually, I really like it for almost any HDR time-lapse I'm doing. So I'm going to click on this one, and as you can see, this is the look of our image right now. If you want to change the preset, you can select another one. For example, if we choose the default one, we can click on the default, and you can see that this is a completely different look for our image. We have a curves adjustment here. We can adjust our image using curves if it's easier for you. You have control over the different color channels of the curves. You can reset the channels and tweak them as needed. I'm not going to use the curves right now. And here are the most important settings. As you can see, here we have some buttons, and if we click this, it's going to flip horizontally the image, and if we click this one, it's going to flip vertically the image. It's a very handy feature to have it in this software, but I prefer, if I'm going to do some flipping of my sequence, I prefer to do it later on in the editing software or in software like After Effects and such. So let's focus on the settings on the right side of the software. The first slider we have is the brightness slider, which is pretty straightforward, and we have a contrast slider here, which again is something that almost everybody who do image editing knows what it does. And most of the sliders here are pretty similar to the Photoshop camera raw dialog. We have a highlights protection slider, and if we increase this slider, you can see that the highlights are reduced, and in this case it doesn't look natural. If we drag this to the left side, you can see that we increase the highlights. So something in the middle around here looks good. We have a highlights slider that, again, if we drag it to the left side, it reduces the highlights, and if we increase it, you can see how the brightness of the image looks like, and especially the highlights of the image. So again, since we are doing HDR, I want it something like this. We have a shadows slider, which if we increase, our image becomes pretty flat because we don't have any contrast anymore. And if we decrease it like so, you can see that we crush the shadows and everything becomes black. So let's try to keep it around 75 in this case, and if you click a single click on the image, zooms out the picture to 100%. And also you can use your scroll. If you put your mouse, for example, here and scroll, you're going to zoom right at this point of the image, and you click and move the image to see how it looks like. And here you can check the zoom level of the image. So I prefer to keep the zoom at 100%, and let's move it and pick a nice part of the image with details, because we have a mid-tone contrast, the micro details slider, and the micro contrast, and these sliders are pretty similar to the Photoshop camera raw clarity slider. As you can see, let me zoom out, if we increase the mid-tone contrast, you can see how it impacts the image. Basically, it increases the contrast in the mid-tones. The name says what the effect does, basically. And the micro details slider, as you can see, if we reduce this to negative 100%, the image starts to look pretty soft. And if we increase it to 100%, we increase basically the contrast in the mid-tones, and that way we have much more detail in our image. And same thing here, you can see if I reduce this to negative 100%, and if I reduce this one as well, you can see how the image looks like. We don't have any contrast in the midtones, and we don't have any details here. And if we increase this one and this one, we have much more details and a lot of contrast, and our image looks pretty nice right now. Now we have a black slider, which basically increases the contrast by crushing the blacks, and I prefer to set this around 30%, 20-30%. I prefer to keep it low because I want a lot of details in my dark areas where are the shadows. We have a sharpening slider, and honestly I prefer to set this one to 0 because it's pretty slow rendering the entire HDR time-lapse sequence using any HDR software, and I prefer to apply sharpening at the final stage where I put together my video, for example in After Effects. So set this to 0 because if you don't like the final result, you will have to render out again the entire sequence, and in my case it took me around 6 hours to render 1000 frames, which divided by 3 is around 330 frames. And for 10 seconds of time-lapse final result, it took me 6 hours to render it. So take in mind that don't apply any sharpening. At the bottom here we have some sliders for color temperature, saturation and hue. The color temperature, pretty straightforward again. If we drag this to the left side here, you can see we get more of a cool tone, and if we drag it to the right side we get more of a warm tone. I prefer to keep it like -15. In this case I want a more cool look for my image. And for the saturation, again, you can increase or decrease it. In this case, again, I prefer to keep it at 0. This is maybe helpful for a single image editing, but when you process an entire sequence and you know that the rendering is going to take a lot of time, make sure that settings like saturation and the color temperature and the hue don't change the settings, because you can apply like a cool tone later on using After Effects, for example, or Premiere Pro for the editing, and it's going to be pretty easy, because if you don't like the final outcome of the sequence, you have to render it again, and it's going to cost you a lot of time and effort to render again the entire sequence. So with that said, I hope everything is clear now. Let's increase the contrast a bit for the image and maybe increase the brightness, or you can decrease it, maybe reduce the blacks, because this is something that you can apply in After Effects later on. Let's set the blacks to 0, because if you want contrast we can apply just a simple curves adjustment in After Effects and have the needed contrast. So I better prefer to have a lot of detail in the shadows that I can play with later on in After Effects. And you can start with a preset. You can see the night preset, and maybe if we increase the shadows here and tweak the highlights just a touch, and maybe increase the midtone contrast in the midtone, the micro details and the micro contrast, this look is something that I like. It's extreme HDR look, but that's what I like. I prefer the effect to be extreme. And now let's see how to export this as a HDR sequence. So the first thing, you need to click here and a batch process dialog appears, and the first thing you need to tell the program is where you keep your raw sequence. So in my case I've already selected where I keep the sequence, which is right this folder here. Let's click OK. Now you need to tell the program what format is your sequence. It's very important, because if you don't choose the right format it's not going to work. So in my case right now I'm using a raw format, so I am going to leave this as default. I have 3 different exposures, so I'm going to leave this one as well. I don't want any size reduction, so I'm going to leave this one as default. I don't want to align the images because they are shot all on a tripod. The only thing I want is the ghosting. I don't want any noise reduction again, because I don't know how the final result is going to look like, and if I don't like it I will have to render it again, and if it renders 6 hours it's going to be a very slow process in order to find the settings that work for me. So again, I prefer to do things such noise reduction in softwares like After Effects, because it's much easier and faster to do. The next step we want to do is to tell the software where to export the sequence. So you just need to click here and choose a output folder, for example like this one, and click OK. You want to choose your image format. You can see the options here. I prefer to use a JPEG at best quality. And finally you need to click Start. And since I already exported the sequence, I'm going to use the exported sequence to edit it in After Effects. And final thing I'd like to mention is this feature here, shut down the computer after processing, which is very handy because if you start the rendering and go to sleep, maybe the render is going to take less time, for example 3 or 4 hours, and you don't want your computer to work all the time, so you can click this one and turn off the computer after processing the sequence. So that's it. That's how to edit and process the HDR sequence and batch process all the files using SNS-HDR Pro. And now let's jump in After Effects to import the exported sequence. So here we are in After Effects, and I'm going just to double click to import the files. And as you can see, the names of the files, if we try to select the first one and select JPEG sequence and try to import it, you can see that it only imports a single frame, which doesn't work for us. We need to delete this and just double click, select the first frame and hit Ctrl A to select all the frames and click open. This is a very easy and quick thing to do in order to be able to export this as a movie file, because if you try to use QuickTime or any other software, you need the numbers to be a sequence numbers, and as you can see, we have numbers that are not sequence and the software can't read them as an entire sequence. It reads them as a separate image files. So in order to fix that, here is a quick thing to do. Select all the files, drag and drop them into a new composition, and select a single composition, and each file is going to be only one frame long. Now let's click OK, and it takes a while because we have a lot of files in 5K resolution, as you can see, and as you expect, the composition is only one frame long and we have all the files here. What we need to do is to go to Composition and choose Composition Settings to open a dialog. We need to set this to, let's see, 12 or 20 seconds long and click OK. And now it's very important. Hold down Ctrl and click on the first image to deselect it. Click on the first image, scroll down to the bottom, hold down Shift and click on the last image. Once you do that, you need to right click and go to Keyframe Assistant and click Sequence Layers and just click OK. And if we make some room here and zoom out, hitting the minus key on the keyboard, you can see that we have all the files in a sequence, and if we hit page down, you can see that it's ready for export. So in order to keep your project organized, you can select all the files and put them into folder and call it images, and select this composition and put it into another composition and hit Ctrl K to open the composition settings, and you can change the resolution, and now you can hit S to reveal the scale properties to resize this, and let's try 39 or 37, and it looks like 37 works pretty good. And now you can move using the arrow keys. If you select the layer, you can move it to reframe it a bit if you want more of the sky, or if you want more of the ground part here and the buildings. You can reframe your shot or even zoom it. Because it's pretty large, you can reframe it and choose to see only the sky here. If you want, set this to 50% because we have a lot of resolution to work with. And once you are ready, you need to export this as a video file so you can edit it in Premiere Pro or any other editing software later on. So you can go to Composition and Add to Render Queue and by default I'm using QuickTime JPEG compression 95% quality. You just need to click here on the output module, and as you click here, a dialog box appears with the output settings, and for the format you need to choose a QuickTime, and for the format options, by default, if you're using After Effects for the first time, it will be animation, which is extremely uncompressed and large file. Once you export it, 10 seconds might be 2 or 3 gigabytes or more. So I suggest exporting the file as a photo JPEG with a quality set to 95%, which produces a great quality files with low file size. And once you're ready, you need to click OK, and here you can see output 2. You need to click here to select your output folder and just click render to export your video file. Before I finish this tutorial, I'd like to mention one thing that can be very helpful. If you are into time-lapse, you may know that you can get some flickering in your time-lapse sequences. In order to fight flicker in the HDR time-lapse sequence, what you need to do is to group your exposures into 3 different folders. I already did it for the well exposed 0 exposure, and I have the -2 and the +2 exposures. And basically it's very time consuming and boring process. You just need to create a new folder and, for example, call it +2, and just select all the +2 files and drag and drop them here in order to be able to edit separately the +2, the 0 and the -2 sequences. So I'm not going to waste your time watching me putting all the images in the folder. I'm going to use the 0 exposure folder here, which is the well exposed image, and I'm going to jump into our time-lapse and load the folder here, initializing the sequence. This is very helpful software that helps deflicker sequences, create day to night, time-lapse transitions and much more. And let's initialize the sequence, and it takes a while to initialize the entire sequence, so I'm going to pause the video and come back when it's ready. So the sequence is fully initialized right now, and for this task I'm going to use the deflicker workflow, and it's pretty easy. Since we are going to do only a deflicker, what you need to do is to define a reference area for the deflicker. So you click this button here, and it gives you a message that tells you what you need to do. Basically, you need to draw a shape here to isolate the area with the flicker, and most of the time the sky will do the job for the flicker. And as you can see, it takes a while to recalculate the brightness values here for the entire sequence, only for this region here. And you have a deflicker button here, which if you click it gives you a slider that you can reduce or increase the deflicker. But the default option works pretty good most of the time, and take in mind that if you don't have any flickering in your sequence, applying a deflicker can cause flickering. Once you're ready, you need to click save, and this is going to save this to the metadata of the files. And now we need to jump into Lightroom. So here we are in Lightroom, and we need to select all of the files and just right click and go to metadata and read metadata from files and read the metadata. And as you can see, trying to deflicker the sequence changes the exposure of the images, trying to deflicker them. And since we don't have any flicker in this sequence, the result is going to be flickering that we created trying to deflicker the sequence. So if the sequence looks good, don't try to deflicker it. using this workflow, you can use any other software to deflicker your sequence. You can use virtual depth mode using the MSU deflicker plugin and deflicker the separate exposures, and it should do the job. And once you deflicker the 3 different sequences, you need to take all of the files from the 3 different folders and put them into single folder again, and after that jump into SNS-HDR Pro or any other HDR software that can do batch processing, and import your first image, edit it, save the settings, and batch process the rest of the images. So that's it. Hope you like this tutorial and find it useful. Once again, I'm Stefan for Tuts Plus, and we'll see you next time.